All right, we have one final piece in the tabernacle to look at tonight, and then we're going to take an in-depth look at the portability of the tabernacle, how they took it down, how they put it up, and does that have anything at all to say to us in 2016? So we're going to turn right now, if you will, in your Bibles to Exodus 25. And you recall when we started on our journey, and can you believe it was 7 weeks ago? I don't know the time, just, every Saturday night, my husband looks at me and says, can you believe it's Sunday morning again in the morning? It's just like the weeks are just going by so fast. But you recall that in Scripture, God begins with what is actually in the very center of the tabernacle, the main piece, which is, of course, the ark. Let me get to that next cutaway here. And he works his way out. He tells them how to do the ark, and then he comes out to the altar of incense, and then these pieces, and he slowly works his way out until he's outside the court. But for the purposes of our study, we just flipped that. We studied it as if we were actually going to the gate, to these curtains here. You recall that that's called the gate. The Israelite would bring their sacrifice here. The priest then would examine it in this area. If it was found to be perfect, then they allowed them to come in. Then here was where the sacrifice was slain. Here is where the carcass and pieces of the sacrifice was offered here on the burning the bronze altar. Then the wash basin, we talked about how they used it to cleanse their hands and cleanse their feet. Every time God said before they went to the altar of sacrifice, and every time before they went into the tabernacle itself. Then we talked about the lampstand and the table of the bread of presence and the altar of incense. And tonight we're going to look at that very, very mysterious piece, the Ark of the Covenant. It has been talked about, it has been hypothesized about over the years. Movies have been made of it. We're all familiar with Indiana Jones trying to discover where it is. And so it remains a very mysterious piece. So let's look at it in Exodus 25, beginning in verse 10. That they shall make an ark of acacia wood, our old friend acacia, okay? 2 cubits and a half shall be its length. And if you recall, we said a cubit was approximately 18 to 20 inches. It varies depending on what scholar you read. A cubit and a half its breadth, and a cubit and a half its height. So it was not that big. It was a relatively small chest, okay? A chest-like piece of furniture. You shall overlay it with pure gold. Inside and outside shall you overlay it. And you shall make on it a molding of gold around it. You shall cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put them on its 4 feet. 2 rings on the side of it, and 2 rings on the other side. You shall make poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with gold. And you shall put the poles in the rings on the sides of the ark, to carry the ark by them. You remember the holy pieces were never to be touched. And that included, you see here in this picture, we see the poles that were used to carry the table of the bread of presence. We see the poles that were used to lift the altar of incense, and we see the poles that were used on the Ark of the Covenant, and also on the bronze altar of sacrifice. This piece was more like, at this time, was more like looked more like a bird bath, really. And it was loaded up on carts. We'll study about that in a little bit. And then the lampstand was also loaded on on a cart pulled by oxen. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark. They shall not be taken from it. And you shall put into the ark the testimony that I will give you. You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2 cubits and a half shall be its length, and a cubit and a half its breadth. And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Of hammered work shall you make them on the ends of the mercy seat. And here you can see that there's smoke rising, but right here and right here is where these cherubim. And most scholars who have studied these particular passages believe that these cherubim, these angels, were probably kneeling, one on one side and one on the other, and their wings, as you'll see right here, On the ends of the mercy seat, make one cherub on the one end and one cherub on the other end. Of one piece with the mercy seat shall you make the cherubim on its ends. The cherubim shall spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat with their wings, their faces one to another. Toward the mercy seat shall the faces of the cherubim be. And you shall put the mercy seat on the top of the ark, and on the ark you shall put, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I shall give you. There, and this of course verse 22 is the verse you want to mark. There I will meet with you. And from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that are on the ark of the testimony, I will speak to you, with you, about all that I will give you in commandment for the people of Israel. So basically, it is believed that that mercy seat may have just been the top itself for the ark, so they could lift that off. And inside the ark were the stone tablets that had the 10 Commandments on them. Inside was the staff of Aaron. You remember we studied last week that had budded and blossomed and borne fruit overnight, a process in nature that normally takes 7 to 8 months. And there was also a small jar in there, and in it was an omar, or a day's portion of manna. And it was to represent all those times throughout those 40 years in the desert that God had been with Israel, that God had guided Israel, that God had provided food and sustenance for them. It was His law, okay, which was represented by the commandments. It was His authority, which was represented by the staff that budded, saying that, Aaron is in fact the person that I've chosen. And it was to remind them also of His constant provision for them in their daily lives. But as I said, it is actually verse 22 that is the key to this. The ark of the testimony, or the ark of the covenant, was actually where God manifested His presence between, supposedly, those two kneeling cherubim. And the way that happened is that on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would go into the Ark of the Covenant. You can turn, if you want to just write this down, I'll just read this, but you can turn to it if you'd like. Leviticus chapter 16, and that entire chapter in Leviticus talks about the Day of the Atonement. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the 2 sons of Aaron, when they drew near before the Lord and died. And the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat that is on the ark, so that he may not die. For I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. But in this way shall Aaron come into the holy place." In other words, there was a specific thing, a specific order of the way things were to be done before even the high priest could go behind the veil and into the Holy of Holies. And here it says, beginning back in verse 3, "But in this way Aaron shall come into the holy place with a bull from the herd for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen coat and shall have the linen undergarment on his body, and he shall tie the linen sash around his waist and wear the linen turban. These are the holy garments." Notice, those of you that have taken my course on threads, he did not have that beautiful bejeweled ephod on. He did not have the ephod itself on. He did not have the blue robe of the ephod. He had only the white, simple linen garment and the sash tied around his waist and the linen turban. Okay? That is such an interesting thing. This is getting off just a little bit, but I just reminded me, thinking about my book on threads, the garments in the Bible. Isn't it interesting that on that one day, see, the high priest wore all those other vestments all the time, 365 days of the year. That designated him as the high priest. But isn't it interesting that when he comes in on that one day, he only wears that one white linen garment that all the other priests wore, and the sash and the turban. What is interesting about that is that garment is actually considered like an undergarment. The things that were then put on top, like a coat or a tunic, those were considered the outer garments. It's interesting because the night before Jesus is crucified, when he goes in to wash the feet of his disciples, he takes off his outer garments. It's like he gets down to the exact same garments that the high priest would have worn on the one day of atonement when he comes into the presence of God. Just a little detail there. You might want to think about that. He shall bathe his body in water and then put them on. And he shall take from the congregation of the people of Israel 2 male goats for a sin offering and 1 ram for a burnt offering. Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering, and he goes on and he tells about that. He says he shall take a censer, down in verse 12 now, he shall take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord. So in other words, he's going back, he's taking the fire that has been lit by God himself, he's taking coals from here, he's putting it in his censer. You know, you've seen the censers with the little chains, and they'll have the container. It says he shall take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of sweet incense beaten small, and he shall bring it inside the veil. In other words, he's taking that into the Holy of Holies. So he's swinging it, and it is smoking, all right? And put the incense on the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat that is over the testimony, so that he does not die. What is God doing there? He's saying, even my appointed and anointed high priest still must separate himself from me, because I am so holy. And that smoking that came up from the incense was to remind Aaron that there was still needed to be a separation from him and the presence of God. It is emphasizing God's holiness again. And he shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the mercy seat on the east side, and in the front of the mercy seat he shall sprinkle some of the blood with his finger 7 times. And it goes on through and tells what all. Verse 20, and when he has made an end of atoning for the holy place and the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat. And he talks on about then all the various things. And it is at that time then, inside here. Now think how dark it's inside here. Okay, we know how dark this is, but I mean, now you're even further in the dark. And can you imagine walking in, and the only glow, the only light is the glow of that censer that he's got with the coals burning, until God himself begins manifesting his presence right between the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant itself. Now, you know, artists through the ages have made renditions of that, have tried to depict what that is like. I've got a beautiful DVD. I wish we had time to watch it. It's done by a wonderful young man, actually, a genius with computers. It's a computerized DVD that is done of a 3D walk through the tabernacle. And the way he shows that Holy of Holies with that glowing gold in there, and then all of a sudden there's a bright light that begins to develop right on the mercy seat. And it just glows, and it just gets whiter and brighter as Aaron the high. We don't know what it looked like, but it had to have been spectacular, because the high priest would sometimes come out of there and just not even be able to speak. That God would manifest His presence before them. Can we even imagine what that must have been like? And so it gives you this idea that there was such awe, had to have been, for this whole complex. Such an incredible sense of mystery and such an incredible sense of power and glory. Really, the Shekinah is manifesting here in the tabernacle in ways that are just unbelievable. Now, I want you to turn back to the very last verses of Exodus. And this is a fabulous scene, all right? I don't know how long it would have taken all of the teams of craftsmen and workmen and artists and, the people that made the linen, that did the weaving, and the people, the embroiderers that did all the embroidery work. I can't even fathom who melted the bronze and then cast these fabulous pieces in the desert, and who created all of these beautiful things, this beautiful lampstand with those gorgeous almond blossoms and the Ark of the Covenant. Can you imagine? And knowing that you were creating something that God was going to use in that kind of way, that was going to manifest His presence. And so it had to have taken months and months for all of these, but you can imagine hundreds of people worked on this. And you remember even that wonderful little verse that we have that the women helped work. They offered their mirrors. They helped with the weaving of all the linen. So it was certainly a group project. So many people working on it. And they got it all ready in chapter 20, the very last chapter in Exodus, and it talks about the day has come. The day has come, chapter 40. In Exodus, the last chapter in Exodus. The day has come. They've got everything ready. They're in the desert now. They're getting ready to set it up and to erect it. At verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, on the first day of the month you shall erect the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, and you shall put in the ark of the testimony, and you shall screen the ark with the veil, and you shall bring in the table and arrange it. They're talking about the table of the bread of presence. And you shall bring in the lampstand and set up its lamps. And you shall put the golden altar for incense before the ark of the testimony, and set up the screen of the door of the tabernacle. And you shall set up the altar of burnt offering before the door of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, and place the basin between the tent of meeting and the altar, and put water in it. And you shall set up the court all around, and hang up the screen for the gate of the court. Then you shall take the anointing oil and anoint the tabernacle and all that is in it, consecrate it and all its furniture, so that it may become holy. You shall also anoint the altar of burnt offering and all its utensils, and consecrate the altar, so that the altar may become most holy. You shall also anoint the basin and its stand, and consecrate it. Then you shall bring Aaron and his sons to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and you shall wash them with water, and put on Aaron the holy garments, and you shall anoint him and consecrate him, and then you shall, and that he may serve me as priest. You shall bring his sons also, and put coats on them, and anoint them, as you anointed their father, that they may serve me as priests. And their anointing shall admit them to a perpetual priesthood throughout their generations. This Moses did according to all that the Lord commanded him, so he did. In the first month of the second year, on the first day of the month, the tabernacle was erected. Moses erected the tabernacle. He laid its bases and set up its frames. He put in its poles and raised up its pillars. You can just imagine the excitement of these workers finally to seeing this thing being all put together, and all the people standing around and outside and trying to catch glimpses of what is going on. And he spread the tent over the tabernacle and put the covering of the tent over it, as the Lord had commanded. He took the testimony, put it in the ark, and put the poles on the ark, set the mercy seat above the ark. You can just imagine him giving directions, and men walking around and pulling things and lifting things, and the excitement that was in the air, and the joy that they must have had in knowing that they had worked so hard to bring this together. He put the table in front of the tent of meeting and on the north side of the tabernacle outside the veil, and arranged the bread. They had the hot holy bread ready. He put the lampstand in the tent of meeting, and he lit it, and he set up the lamps before the Lord. He put the golden altar in the tent of meeting before the veil, and they began burning the incense. They had the incense ready to be burned, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He put in place the screen for the door of the tabernacle, and he set the altar burnt offering at the entrance of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, and offered on it the burnt offering. Put the incense in there, the grain offering. He set the basin between the tent of meeting and the altar, and so on and so forth. Did the washing. They've all now washed their hands. And then this incredible few verses to close Exodus, verse 34. Then, got all this ready, and I don't know that they had any idea what to expect. I think it's like today sometimes when we get involved in something that we know or we are pretty sure that God's hand is on it, but we don't really know for sure what He's going to do or how He's going to show up. So Moses finished the work, and then it just says, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. They're getting everything in place, and I don't know if the last pole was slipped in or the last curtain hung, I don't know, but all of a sudden we've got the cloud is over the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord is filling the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to even enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it. You've just suddenly got this enormous cloud and it could not have been static. This is a moving, bubbling, it's a cloud. It's something you can just imagine, almost like a small little wind tornado that sets down. But I can just imagine it moving and bubbling, and it was so enormous that and thick, I would imagine, and mysterious that Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and the fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. God manifests His presence. And maybe it comes up like this in my DVD. This young artist has it like going up almost like a column of fire by night and a column of smoke by day. And it never left them for the entire 40 years that they were in the desert. That cloud by day and that fire by night. And when the high priest would go into behind the veil into the Holy of Holies, he actually could see a manifestation. Bright light, a bubbling, some sort of who knows what. But that was where God chose to manifest His very presence in their midst. We go back to that Exodus 25:8, and I said at the beginning of this, if you ever get this verse and let it penetrate your mind and your heart, you'll never be the same again. God says, let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell in their midst. Unlike every other monarch or earthly king or czar or tyrant, no earthly ruler has ever purposefully decided to live right in the middle of his peasants, right in the middle of the people that he rules. Only God comes to us and says, I want to live right where you are, right in your midst. What an amazing thing. And they built it for him. They all worked together and built it for him. It is just an incredible, incredible thing. I want to spend just a few minutes tonight before we get to the very last of the taking up, because that is such a fascinating thing, the moving of the tabernacle. I thought you might just like to look ahead and see what happened to the ark. I'm going to give you some verses. We're going to trace it, and I'm going to show you the very last place in the Old Testament that the ark is ever actually mentioned. Okay? It's the last reference. Now we can make some speculation about some of the other remaining places, but we're going to look. So I want you to turn now to 2 Chronicles 5. Now this is after Solomon, okay, has built the temple. This is 2 Chronicles. This is after Solomon has built the temple in Jerusalem. And they actually have a scene that is very much like what has just happened, okay? Chapter 5, 2 Chronicles, chapter 5, and I'm just going to go through this chapter just sort of randomly, so just have it open and I'll tell you what verse I'm going to light on as we go along. And by the way, in the book, I have an entire section just on the temple. In fact, there were several temples actually, but on Solomon's temple when he got it built. Let me just tell you this one thing. This is so neat. I won't move ahead. After class, maybe if we have time, I'll show you. But this wash basin, when Solomon builds it, holds 100,000 gallons of water. It's really an above-ground pool. It was 8 feet deep. It rested on 12 life-sized oxen. It was a large basin, and they could actually swim in it. They could get their whole bodies in it and wash. The priest. It was that large, okay, 100,000 gallons. And in order to get water then all the way around the courtyard of the temple, Solomon's temple, they created little like carts, beautiful little bronze carts on wheels that carried gallons and gallons of water. It took like 4 or 5 men just to push those little carts. But they then could just take the carts over to where the tables where they were slaughtering the animals, and the priests could keep their hands washed that way. But there was an enormous, I call it an above-ground pool, but it was the wash basin. The altar of sacrifice, becomes enormous. It's raised way up, maybe 8 or 10 feet high off the ground. You had to access it by an enormous ramp. The priests had to walk up the ramp in order to get, because they were doing so by that time. You know, the number of sacrifices had increased by, 1,000-fold. In the inside of the holy place, instead of one lampstand, they had 10, 5 down each side. They still had the table of the bread of presence, and they still had the altar of incense, and the Ark of the Covenant was the same. And that's what we're getting ready to look at. Solomon has built this temple, and they used tons of gold to build it. Tons of cypress. He harvested the large cypress trees, the cedars down from, used cypress in it, but he brought all those cedars down from Lebanon. It's a fascinating story how they built that. But look in I'll start in verse 1 of chapter 5, 2 Chronicles. Thus all the work that Solomon did for the house of the Lord was finished. So we're at the same juncture with the temple as we've just read about the tabernacle. And Solomon brought in the things that David his father had dedicated, and stored the silver, the gold, and all the vessels in the treasuries of the house of God. Then verse 2, Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the fathers' houses of the people of Israel in Jerusalem, to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. David had the Ark of the Covenant brought to him. Okay? And he pitched a tent. You remember that scene? He pitched a tent and was keeping the ark in the tent. No longer in the tabernacle. David decided that he wanted it closer to him, the ark. So he pitched a tent not far from his palace, and he placed the ark in there. So now Solomon, David's dead, Solomon has built the temple, and they're going to bring the Ark of the Covenant up, out, and place it into the temple. Then the priest brought the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house. This is the stone temple, in the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim. Now, these cherubim, the wings here, in the Holy of Holies, in the temple, Solomon's temple, were 8 or 9 feet high. And they created them this way. They had a wingspan that spanned from wall to wall. These two cherubim stood behind. I mean, the sight must have been unbelievable. These enormous statues that they made, and they were angels, one on either side of the Ark of the Covenant. Their wingspan in the middle touched tip to tip on the wings, and then their wings on the outside touched the walls. Enormous angelic statues looking over the Ark of the Covenant, okay? But look down at verse 10. And it says, and the poles were so long, the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, and they are there to this day. And verse 10, there was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets that Moses put there at Horeb. So, somewhere along the way, we've lost an Omar full of manna, and we've lost Aaron's staff that budded, okay? And you can just, imagine after all the moves and different things that had happened. But it's funny to me that they would add that detail. It's just a little, we didn't have quite the number of things in it that we did before. So now we still do have the stone tablets. So it goes on down, and they have this incredible celebration. And Solomon blesses the people. Now, at this point, when he is doing this at the temple, he's got thousands and thousands and thousands of worshipers there, and they're singing, they're playing harps, and they're doing the flutes, and they're worshiping. They're having this incredible celebration. And then chapter 7, look at this, in 2 Chronicles, beginning with verse 1. Solomon has made this incredible prayer. You can read it in chapter 6. As soon as Solomon finished his prayer, look what happened. Almost the exact same thing as when they erected the tabernacle. Fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. To what extent? To the extent that the priest could not even enter the house of the Lord, because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. When all the people of Israel saw the fire come down and the glory of the Lord on the temple, they bowed down with their faces to the ground on the pavement and worshiped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. In other words, they were so overcome by this fire rushing out from the temple, you can only imagine, that they absolutely threw themselves to the ground with their face down. It goes on, it talks about the dedication of the temple and the things that happened. And then, unfortunately, as time goes on, the kings that come after Solomon are just, you have a few that try to follow. You have a few that come in, but it just seems like they go down, down, down. Finally, you even have, and you probably remember this from your history, you even have some kings that are offering child sacrifices in the temple with all this magnificent, and with the Ark of the Covenant, where God himself had continually manifested his presence. You have, at one point, you even have temple prostitutes. I mean, it becomes so sordid, so incredibly sordid. And then you have a time when sometimes these kings would come back and they would recognize that they had gotten so off track, and they would ask for forgiveness. But you see here in chapter 12, Egypt plunders Jerusalem, okay? And we get down to about verse 9. So Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, and God takes his hand off to allow this. He took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away the shields of gold that Solomon had made. Now, it doesn't refer specifically to the Ark of the Covenant, but this verse is the one that people look at that say they want to say that the Ark is today somewhere in the desert of Egypt. Okay, those are the verses that they look at. But it does not say specifically that Shishak takes it away. Okay? Now he evidently took a lot of the treasures, and he may have. But by chapter 35, 2 Chronicles, okay? 2 Chronicles, I'm still in 2 Chronicles chapter 35. This is Josiah. Now Josiah comes and he does some good things. He does some reform, and he brings the temple back to a lot of its previous glory. And it says, Josiah kept a Passover to the Lord in Jerusalem, and they slaughtered the Passover lamb on the 14th day of the first month. He appointed the priests to their offices and encouraged them in the service of the house of the Lord. And he said to the Levites who taught all Israel and who were holy to the Lord, put the holy ark in the house that Solomon the son of David, king of Israel, built. You need not carry it on your shoulders. Mysterious, don't know why, because it was always supposed to be carried on the shoulders. Now serve the Lord your God and his people Israel. That's the last actual reference in the Bible to the Ark of the Covenant, where it actually says we know it is the Ark. So at this point, the time of Josiah, they still had the Ark of the Covenant in the holy place, all right? The priest would still go in. We don't know for sure what kind of manifestation that God did at that time, okay? But that is the last time it is actually referred to and named in the entire Bible. But think how much longer the temple goes on. I mean, in Jesus' day, the priests were still carrying on all those services and ministries, all right? Now I want you to look on the very next page, and this is the very last chapter in 2 Chronicles. It's chapter 36, and we're going to drop down to verses 17. The kings have finally completely run their course. They have been disobedient. They have defiled the temple. They have done all these incredible things against the Lord. And we'll go back to just a couple of verses before, verse 15. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers because he had compassion on his people. See, he's still trying to give them one last chance. And on his dwelling place, in other words, he didn't want to leave his dwelling place. He wanted to stay. Verse 16, but they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people. And then today I put on my Facebook page, these are some of the saddest words I have ever read. Look at that last phrase, verse 16, last chapter, 2 Chronicles, until there was no remedy. He continued to try to help them, try to get them to come back to him. And then finally he just takes his hands off. He has sent messengers, he's sent prophets, but they keep mocking the prophets, the messengers of God, despising his word, scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose up against his people, until there was no remedy. And then verse 17, therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary. In other words, there were some that were killed in the temple itself, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or aged. He gave them all into his hand, and all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king, and of his princes, all these he brought where? To Babylon. Babylon. And they burned the house of God, broke down the walls, burned all its palaces with fire, destroyed its precious vessels. And they took into Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to the king of Babylon. Now, just a little detail. You notice even in that passage, they don't specifically mention the Ark of the Covenant. We can only guess. Perhaps it was part of the treasures that they took. Don't know. But there are some that believe that those priests saw what was coming. Possibly they took the ark and hid it somewhere on the Temple Mount, buried it in the ground. You don't know. It's one of, in terms of archaeology, it's one of the things that's probably so frustrating for people like the archaeologists that are members of our church, because they are not allowed to dig underneath the Temple Mount. You know, the very Temple Mount itself now is owned. It's part of the Islamic world, the exact mount. But let me just bring up a couple of things. Since going into the Holy of Holies was where God manifested His presence, and since that was done every single year, just think about this. In Jesus' day, they still did that ceremony. The high priest on the Day of Atonement went in to the Holy of Holies in the temple. There was nothing there. As far as scholars can determine, he went in and he threw the blood on a rock. There was no more Shekinah. The Shekinah had left the temple. And there's an exact verse in, I think it's Jeremiah, that actually says the Shekinah had gone. The Shekinah left. It would stop, and then eased out a little bit further until it was gone completely. And so in Jesus' day, on the Day of Atonement, when they had this enormous ceremony and all of that was going on, these priests were going into a completely empty place. It's a sad thing, really, when you think about it. But what makes it even more ironic is that Shekinah was standing right with them. The glory of God was no longer inside that oath. He was right with them. Okay? Right quickly, I just want to show you just a couple of little things about the movie. We won't have time to go into it completely. But the way they would take down all of this, okay, this whole thing, Levi, the man who was head of the Levites, the father of all of that tribe, had 3 sons. He had Gershon, he had Merari, and he had a son called Kohath. And I want you to look in Numbers, and we'll start in chapter 3. Numbers chapter 3. Now I tell you what, turn in, we'll do chapter 4. They list them in both chapter 3 and chapter 4. We'll start with chapter 4, verse 21. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take a census of the sons of Gershon, also by their fathers, from 30 years old to 50 years old, you shall list them, all who can come to do duty, to do service in the tent of meeting. This is the service of the clans of the Gershonites in serving and bearing burdens. They shall carry the curtains of the tabernacle and the tent of meeting with its covering and the covering of goat skins that's on top." In other words, all of the hangings. When they were ready to pack this thing, to deconstruct it, to take it down and pack it, God told Moses, you get the tribes to donate carts, wooden carts, and oxen. And so they must have had, who knows, several dozen of those. And so when the curtains were taken down and all these various pieces, they would roll them up and they would place them on these oxen carts. You can imagine it was like a parade when they got ready to move. It was like a circus, just like I said last week. It's exactly like putting up and taking down a circus tent. And each person had their duty that they did. And so the Gershonites were serving and bearing burdens. In other words, the heavy lifting of things. These curtains must have weighed a ton. In order to get these things down, can you imagine? The Gershonites would have had ladders. And on a circus canvas, they'll use 40 or 60 men and spread that canvas out on the ground, and then in a row, they start rolling it. 40 or 60 men in a row, and they roll it until they get it all rolled up. Well, they probably had some kind of a system just like that. This thing is 60 feet long, these curtains, 45 feet wide. And so it was a task, and that's what the Gershonites did. They had charge of all the curtains and all those kinds of things. Look on down now in verse 29. And as for the sons of Merari, you shall list them by their clans, so on and so forth. And this is what they are charged to carry. I'm reading in verse 31. As the whole of their service in the tent of meeting, the frames of the tabernacle, okay, they didn't have charge of the Gershonites had all the curtains and things. The Merari had these frames, the very heavy, 15 feet high, 27 inches wide. Acacia wood, had to be so careful with them because they're covered in gold foil. You've got all these loops and poles that they've got to, and the pillars and the bases around the court, with their bases, pegs, and cords. In other words, all these cords that hold up everything and these pegs, that's what the Merari were in charge of. So they must have organized in a certain way, and you probably had groups of 10 or 15 or 20, and they each had their task, and they knew exactly what they were to do. I bet they got, just like circus roustabouts, I bet they got to the place they could take this thing down and put it up just like clockwork. Everybody knew exactly what they were supposed to do. They had done it dozens of times, and they were ready to go with it. Now look at this. We turn back the beginning of chapter 4. The Lord spoke to Moses, take a census of the sons of Kohath between 30 and 50 years old, and here's what they're to do. This is the service of the sons of Kohath in the tent of meeting. The Kohathites had the most holy things that they were in charge of. What does that mean? Well, the Kohathites were to being responsible for the altar, the basin, the lampstand, the table of the bread of presence, the altar, and finally, the Ark of the Covenant. The Kohathites carried all the holy things. When the camp is to set out, Aaron and his sons shall go up and take down the veil of the screen and cover the Ark of the Testimony. They didn't just, you couldn't just see it. It says they took the veil, and they used that to cover the ark. So once they got it, 2 or 3 layers of coverings on it, then they were ready to go. With this on, you go on down and it says, then they shall put on it a covering of goat skin, and spread on top of that a cloth all blue, and shall put on it on its poles. Then I want to give you just this one more thing. See if I can find it. All of the holy things were to be carried on the shoulders. No one was supposed to touch any of the holy things with their hands. That's why they had poles. They were always to be carried on the shoulders. And you know, as I was reading that and studying that, what that reminded me of? Where did Christ have to carry his cross? And I got to thinking about that. Wouldn't it be something if those burdens that we think we carry sometimes, and you know we always use that, that's always the metaphor that we use, a burden on our shoulders, or something that's heavy on my shoulders. What in fact if those things, because they have such a tendency to bring us closer to the Lord? Have you ever noticed that? When things are joyous, somehow, you remember him. But man, it's not like when the doctor comes back and tells you, the test came back and it's cancer. It's just all of a sudden you are just so locked in to wanting his presence and wanting him with you. Maybe those things that we carry on our shoulders then turn out to be holier things than we think in our lives, because they push us closer to him. Just a thought. At any rate, the most holy things were carried always on the shoulders. Now, let me just leave you with this last thought. It says down in chapter 4, the last verse. According to the commandment of the Lord through Moses, they were listed, each one with his task of serving or carrying. Thus they were listed by him as the Lord commanded Moses. And so now that we are the temple and we are the priesthood, literally, Peter is clear about that and Hebrews is clear about that. Here's what we have to ask ourselves, each one with his task of serving or carrying. Who are you serving and what are you carrying? Maybe you're like a Gershonite. The Gershonite were those who carried burdens. Have you ever met somebody that is so good at giving you encouragement that just every time you have a burden, they just step right in and help you carry that? Or maybe you have that gift. You just are able to be an encourager. Or maybe you don't have that gift, but you know someone that needs a helping hand right now, that you could help carry that burden. That was what the Gershonites did. The Meraris, on the other hand, were given something that looks like on the surface is not a very important thing. They were asked to carry pegs, tent pegs, okay? The Kohathites, on the other hand, were given what appeared to be such a glamorous job. Now just think about this. If you were just an average Israelite, this thing was coming down, what part of that would you really want to see? Well, you want to see these holy things, and you especially would like to catch a glimpse of the Ark of the Covenant. But God has asked you instead to carry a tent peg. But did you know that even when a circus tent is ready to be put up, do you know what the first thing is that goes into the ground? The pegs. They do the outline first, and I suspect that was exactly what happened here. In other words, you would not have had the structure itself raised until these tent pegs had been marked out on the ground so they would know where to place the tent. In other words, what God is saying with all of this, and with each one having his own task of serving or carrying, that every single thing that we now as a group as a priesthood, come together, there is no task that is greater than the other. There's nothing that God asks you to do that is greater than what He's asking somebody else to do. In other words, every task is important, every job is important, every gift is important. That it's not like somebody has been given a gift and, oh, I wish I had those holy things to carry. All I've got is a tent peg. They all work together, and without any of those doing their jobs, then this tabernacle and this tent of meeting and this court would have never have arisen up through the desert. The same with us today. As we close our session, I've enjoyed having you so very much. We don't have enough time to go over. I wanted to go over some chapters in Hebrews, but I'll just make sure you read Hebrews 9. And you will absolutely love reading through it because it will mention almost every piece in the tabernacle. It should come alive to you now in a way that hopefully wasn't before. So let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, thank you so much for bringing us together to study your incredible tabernacle. Father, we ask that you just simply come and dwell in our minds and our hearts. Make us the living temple. Tabernacle with us now, Father. These things we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank y'all so much. Enjoyed it tremendously.